recording going. All right, well, welcome everybody. We're digging into the hard part of this book, probably the most uncomfortable part of the conversation we've been having. Yet Latasha points out to us that restitution is a thoroughly biblical concept in both the Old and the New Testaments. And we also learned that reparations have been sought and won by the Japanese American victims. Many of them are their descendants who were put into internment camps here in the United States during World War II. But most people today have a very negative reaction when you talk about reparations, particularly for African Americans and Native Americans. I found it interesting that the Japanese Americans were able to make their case. Maybe people saw it as much more blatant in terms of the wrongness of it, and that maybe they had a hand in it too. It's hard to know. I have a friend by the name of Ann Wilson. Ann is 100% Japanese American, and both her parents were in camps during World War II, I believe as children or maybe teenagers. Matter of fact, I think that may be where they met. I will see her in a little while. She was very close to Fane Downs. And so as we go out to Mo Ranch and celebrate Fane's life once again, I'm going to ask Ann if her parents got reparations and let you all know.
Good.
I thought that was interesting.
Can I make a comment about that?
Yeah, please do.
And it's very quick, but I did some research this morning on this General DeWitt, who really was the instigator, and that's what I would call him, of the internment.
Okay.
He was from Iowa. Let me just tell you a little bit of background and then see if there are any similarities as we look at what happened in the election. For instance, Iowa, 80%, 88% white, 10% Native American, less than 1% black. Now that's today, but back when he was born in the late 1800s, late 1800s, probably a lot less black even. But he also was schooled in going to Philippines for the Filipino War. He went to Mexico for Pancho Villa. So that was all him. He was learning stuff about people. He called them undesirables when he wrote his papers. And guess what? How the internment started and actually was promulgated through an executive order by the president. So just all these words that we're hearing today. This was 70 years ago, 75 years ago. We're still hearing them. So anyway, I'll stop there. But
that's very helpful and very good background. It's interesting how our government has shifted so much to so much power in the executive branch, and we've certainly been seeing that as the last few years. So with that, I'd like to look at those biblical references that she talks about. And I think it's on page, let me find it again. Yeah, page 155. In the middle of the page, talks about reparation being a thoroughly biblical concept. And look down a little bit further, and she says, take Numbers, the book Numbers 5, verse 7, for example, where God tells Moses what people must do when they wrong another person. They must confess their sin and make full restitution for what they have done, adding an additional 20% and returning it to the person who was wronged. And then she goes on to say how the word in Hebrew, shuwab, help me here, Susan. Thank you. And says it's used almost 1,000 times in the Old Testament. In a minute, I'm going to show you a document that was actually put together by a task force of the General Assembly a number of years ago, and it has quite a few references in it, biblical references, and I suspect I don't think there was 1,000, but I think there's a lot of them, and I suspect that a lot of them have this concept in them. But it's interesting as you move into the New Testament, and I think it's an attribute to the gospel writers that it seems like everything that is talked about from the Old Testament during New Testament times is um, thought to be not just carrying out the letter of the law, but doing it, expanding it. Jesus expanded what people would say to him about the law. And he said, I did not come to do away with it, but I came to fulfill it. And with that, there's this magnificent and graceful expansion. And so the story of Zacchaeus, although it's Zacchaeus who says what he will do, if you turn the page on 156, after he's come face to face with Jesus, he says, I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord. And if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much. That's not 20%. That's 400%. And so again, it's this expansive take on the Old Testament law to be the fulfilling of one's heart, the one that what God would have one do if you had truly repented and wanted to make restitution. Let me pull up that. It was called the Reparations Task Force. And it's, well, the one I have actually is the one from the Racial Reconciliation. Whoops, I forgot to share my screen. Wait a minute. Whoops, go back, Judy. Share your screen. Okay. Here we go. Can you all see that? Okay. So it's the report to the task force to study reparations. It started out as a task force for racial reconciliation. It's quite lengthy. I don't want to, look at it word for word, but I just kind of want to scroll through it just a little bit and look back how far this was, 2004. They worked on it during 2003 and brought it to, and there is a committee, the Advocacy Committee for Racial Ethnic Concerns, that is a permanent committee of the General Assembly. And so they worked with them. Down at the very, very, very bottom of the report, it gives the people who were on it. And one of them is Lydia Hernandez, who is a longtime member of Mission Presbytery and has been involved in many, many things within the heart of where we live, particularly with Hispanic ministries. But she was one of the co-chairs of this. So the point of the report, and you remember kind of how this works in our General Assembly, you have these groups that are appointed usually by the moderators from the previous assembly, and they work for however many years, usually 2. I've been serving on one now, and that group has been in place for 4 years. And so they work on these, they gather information, they interview people, they look for resources, and that's what this group has done. So it just begins affirming that Jesus Christ calls us to repair wrongs done to one another and to work for personal and social reconciliation and renewal. The General Assembly Council, on behalf of the Task Force to Study Reparations and in consultation with the Advocacy Committee for Racial Ethnic Concerns, that the 216th General Assembly, so that was 2004, take the following actions. Now, this has gone to a committee, and then the committee has to vote whether to send it on to the whole assembly, which they did, and it was adopted. But like many things that happen with General Assembly papers, et cetera, it kind of doesn't go very far after that. The article that I sent you that Alonzo Johnson had written makes reference to this. So that's how I found it. So you can see all the recommendations, and it's interesting that it commends the Belhar Confession. And as you know, we went on to actually adopt the Belhar, this confession out of South Africa, and it is now part of our Book of Confessions. So Julie and others who are right now in the new officers training have that new Book of Confessions with the Belhar in it. And then lastly, it directs the Office of the General Assembly and the General Assembly Council, which is now called the Mission Presbyterian Mission Agency, the Office of Theology and Worship, to receive responses, prepare a summary, and report results to the 218th, which is 4 years later, together with possible recommendations for the further engagement with the Belhar Confession. That did happen, and the Assembly passed adopting the Belhar, but it didn't pass the presbyteries that go round. So it actually came back to the Assembly a couple of years later and was passed again. And this time, the presbyteries, by a 2/3 majority, and it has to be 2/3 to amend the Book of Confessions, did adopt it. And so now it is there. So there's comments. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit more. It gives you the body of the Belhar. I'm not going to read all of that, but it is about racial reconciliation. And so I commend that to you. You can find it online very, very easily. So it goes on to make other requests for this church to do study. And here comes Bonnie. Let me in. Let her in. And this one I thought was interesting, number 10, get a little higher. Request the PCUSA Washington office to monitor and advocate for legislation related to reparations, renewal, and reconciliation, including the bill introduced by Representative John Conyers, calling for the creation of a commission to study reparations proposals for African Americans and report their efforts. I looked it up, and John Conyers has been introducing this bill since the 90s. He's a long-term congressman. I can't remember where he's from. And it goes usually through the Black Caucus, and it's never been allowed to come to the floor. I'm wondering now, with a Democratic majority in the, as a matter of fact, I think maybe it did finally pass the state of the House, but Mitch McConnell would not allow it to come to the floor of the Senate. And I'm going to show you a video in a little while to which McConnell is referred. So going on down, it's directing the state clerk to communicate with the president, that means of the United States, members of the United States Senate and the House, urging passage of legislation calling for the creation of a commission to study. I think that in itself is, makes a lot of sense. Okay, we're not going to jump in and start handing out money, but to study it and to determine a way. And there are, as I was looking through, just Googling reparations, I found that the Lutheran Church has a study group, looking at reparations, and that there are several state governments, and then even some city councils that have passed legislation to look at and study reparations. Some have even made a response. There are also some institutions of higher learning like Harvard and Princeton who have done things like set up part of their endowment funds or to cover scholarships for African Americans as a way of reparation. So this is being looked at a lot more closely. So in some ways this document's dated, in other ways it's kind of like the groundwork for what we're beginning to see now. So I'm going to scroll down just a little bit more, and this is their rationale. So they add a lot of scripture to their paper as they want to undergird what they're saying. And so this paragraph right here, the question of whether or not the United States government should pay reparations to people on whom it has inflicted harm is being raised in America and around the globe. Books and articles from newspapers and magazines have been and are being written. Radio and television talk shows are sponsoring discussions and debates on the topic. Teachers are raising the question of reparations in classrooms at all grade levels throughout the nation. and churches are studying the propriety of developing policy statements that address the question. So let me go down a little bit further. And again, there's a lot here. Here's another reference from Deuteronomy, one from our larger catechism of the Book of Confessions. I'm going to move on down a little bit to find what I really want to point out. There's also references to Native Americans and their discrimination and the things that were taken from them. Okay, the next steps in the reparation process involve repairing the breach, which comes from Isaiah, caused by the sinful behaviors of the just, and making every effort to restore the dignity and the material losses of those who've been harmed. And it talks about something that happened in South Africa. That was a UN proclamation. And that's being lifted up. Now here it is about John Conyers. He was introduced this Bill House Resolution 40, the Commission to Study Reparations for African Americans Act, 1989. That was the first year he introduced it. The Conyers Bill is just one of the more recent efforts to secure reparations for African Americans. And that gets us in 1867. But I thought the article that Mary Ellen found about the 40 acres and a mule was fascinating, that those Black ministers were the ones who worked with the Sherman to pass that bill. And if you just think about what would have been like if Andrew Johnson, had not set aside that bill, and we had think about the whole coastline of Carolinas down through Georgia and Florida, had been an African-American place where people grew their own food, had their own government, and had possession of land, what that might have made a difference in the life of our country. So it says here, a simple apology from the United States for its role in the establishment and maintenance by law and through economic mandate of the systematic enslavement of millions of African peoples for 249 years would go a long way toward healing the racial breach between European and African Americans. Opponents of reparations for slavery argue variously that they never held slaves and therefore should not be held accountable for the deeds of their foreparents. Descendants of slaves should quit complaining about the past and pour their energies into improving the present and building the future. African Americans are just looking for a handout. So much time has passed since the abolition of slavery that the subject should be forgotten. A nationwide discussion about the propriety of paying reparations to African Americans in particular will further polarize the country along racial lines. These dangerous arguments deny a fundamental spiritual truth. Confession is good for the soul and essential for healing and renewing our spirits. I'm going to go way on down and get to the conclusion. So here's more scripture, one from Leviticus, one again from the Heidelberg Catechism. And it reads, the Lord is the sovereign Lord of all creation. Everything and everyone was created by God for God's glory. We, along with all of God's creation, are to worship and enjoy God forever. Our worship and enjoyment of God is the tie that binds us together with one another and God's whole creation. However, our sin against God, one another, and God's creation has rendered us spiritually broken and relationally disconnected from God, our neighbors, and the world in which we live. And it goes on much more. But this is, I'm going to show you these end notes. How many, this is all the references they have. But then look at, this is, well, me show you this first. This was a Presbyterian panel. I don't know if any of you have ever participated in a Presbyterian panel. It's the research arm of our denomination. And they always contact members, elders, and ministers to get to compare their answers. So in this case, they surveyed 1,052 members, 1,305 elders, and 1,403 ministers. And it looks like about half of those returned the survey. So there's a lot of questions in it, and one of them was, which phrase below do you think does the best job of capturing the meaning of the term reparations as you understand it? And you can see that, a lot of the people put in making amends, repairing wrongs. The next question is, how far would you say the United States has come towards achieving racial reconciliation? And the majority is the task is far from accomplished. Skip a couple of these. This is a good one. Are you aware that reparations have been paid? And it references the Japanese Americans. Most people said yes. Some said no. And then the Swiss government to the Jewish people, and the German corporations to people who were forced to work in World War II, by Canada, by New Zealand, by Austria, by the United States government to some Native American peoples. Okay, so this is asking, how often have you heard anything about reparations? And remember, this is back in 2003. How familiar or unfamiliar are you with the proposal to have the federal government make reparations to African Americans? Do you think the federal government should or should not pay money? And the majority say should not. So now we're getting down to the nitty gritty, right? When it comes to money, people have different opinions. How important is the subject? Not too important, many people said. And let's see, this one's important. Do you think the PCUSA General Assembly should take a stand or issue a policy statement on the issue of reparations to African Americans? And again, you get a large percentage that says no. So you see, there really is resistance among all kinds of people, including us. The next appendix is about, I just want to show you these scriptures to study. So here's this long list from about remembering, repairing, and restoring, and reconciling. So it's broken down very nicely as to where you can find biblical references. And then there's a long bibliography, and I was going to show you the name. Here's Lydia's name right here as the co-chair person. So I'm going to stop that share and stop reading and ask you to respond to anything you heard or saw. John.
Just while you were talking, I looked up the CBO. Remember, the Congressional Budget Office is the one who puts the money tag on things. Mm-hmm. I looked up House Resolution 40. As of today, they have not provided an estimate of the cost of reparations in 2020 as of today. So that tells you also the unwillingness of our government, and it's a Democratic House, and has been, to go forward with this. So this is not just resistance among red people, if you will. It's resistance all across the board.
Yeah, I think that it's such a big, it would probably be such a big number that people just can't get their heads around how you would administer it, how you would do it. Sue.
Do most people think of this in terms as giving individual people money? Or
I think they do, and I think that's where the hang-up comes.
Well,
and that's why I think, go ahead.
One of the articles that you sent information to us to read, I found really interesting when it said going in and improving their schools, improving their neighborhoods, doing things like that give people hope and help themselves. That's That sounds to me like what's more beneficial.
Mhm. And I
I know
think
it
that's
takes money,
like
but-
I mentioned, you know, some of the schools giving scholarships. And then this one city council, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on where it is. I think it's in Virginia, that that's exactly what they're doing. They're talking about setting up programs and things like that that would be beneficial to African American, particularly children. Julie.
Well, most of the examples that I read and everything that we had for today, the immediate reparation of goods or financial help came within that generation where the wrong occurred to me. Whereas as I evaluate where we are now, I do see inequalities still, like financial, people can't go to the bank and get a loan because they don't have any collateral help. Things like that we can do or facilitate to people that haven't had the advantages we have in our white skin.
Yeah, I thought one of the, what was talked about in the article, the Atlantic article that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote was the story of the man who moved out of the South, went to Chicago and bought a house, but was cheated out of it because it was from a loan shark, if you will. And that happened so frequently in that era because they couldn't get a loan anywhere else. And speaking of him, I'd like to show you a quick YouTube of Ta-Nehisi Coates testifying before Congress. So let me see if I can get that up one more time. Okay. Come on.
Can't hear it.
Let's see if I can get the sound up a little bit. This is one of those things about YouTube I'm always a little weak on. Just a minute. Is that better?
Sign those streets. Many of us would love to be taxed for things you're solely responsible.
I'm sorry, I still can't hear it.
No, we still can't hear it.
Okay. I don't know. This may be my speaker system. Let me try one more time.
Extends beyond our individual and personal reach.
Still?
It seemed ridiculous to dispute invocations of the founders, the greatest generation, the basis of a lack of membership.
Just barely.
We recognize our lineage as a generational trust, as inheritance, and the real dilemma posed.
Okay, I won't make you strain. It's like,
Share that link.
yeah, I will. I'll do that. Okay, let me take that down just a second. All right. So anyway, basically he was testifying before Congress about the bill one more time that was coming before Congress. Maybe one other thing. Okay. So let's take a look now at the questions on page 167 and 168. I thought the first question was interesting. If you can put yourself in Zacchaeus' shoes, How is the desire to make reparations in the way Zacchaeus expressed different from guilt? How is reparation related to the concepts of equality and equity? Why did Zacchaeus suddenly become so generous?
It was a spiritual transformation on his part. He met Jesus.
Oh, yeah, he met Jesus. Yeah, you can say that's a metaphor, but it may really have happened, and suddenly he was a different man, and recognized his what he'd done was wrong, whether that's guilt or just a true repentance. So how is reparation related to the concepts of, we've already talked about it, it's just you've touched on a little bit of equality and equity, what you were saying, Julie, earlier about making things better for others, and being intentional about that, using government money.
I think the problem when you get down into dollars is the equity. How do you ever define the value of what you're trying to do? And that's where the breakdown comes. And so when we talk about community projects, that kind of thing, I think it's a lot easier to go around it. But one of the things I was wondering this week when I was reading it was, affirmative action has kind of gone a full cycle. What would the relationship of this be in terms of affirmative action? Would it be a separate, complete category so that we're not giving favorable treatment to a certain subset of the culture?
I don't know. What do you think? How would you answer that question yourself?
Well, I don't know. That's why I'm posing it. I don't really have enough. I should think not, but it does seem like it was about 12 years ago when it was really the big thing, and then all the court cases and so on, and it's all kind of gone away. And now this is sort of another fresh breath of air.
Right.
But I should think it's still being considered a reparation would be different from an affirmative action, but because there's a debt or a requirement involved in it. But
no, I think you're right. I think that's a good way to distinguish the two.
I think the monetization of it is a huge issue, because we can sit and fight over nitpick dollars and cents on anything because we all value things differently.
Right. I thought it was fascinating that the Japanese American reparation, that somebody named $1, I guess it was the president, amount, and that did it. Is that what it would take? I don't know.
A lot of time had passed too, though. 40 years.
Yeah, and a very strong advocacy among that population.
Yeah,
well educated.
Well, and I think the citizenship and the war service were the other two things that.
Right.
Yeah, the American Indian certainly is a native citizen of the land, and that seems to not have served them very well.
Not very well. There have been a few where there was some reparations, but few and far between, and a lot of atrocities, as we know from reading about the schools that the children were put in and that sort of thing. If somebody else was going to say something, I heard a voice.
Well, I was going to say something, but I think that some of this is different in different parts of our country.
Mm-hmm. Sure is. Okay.
I don't think it's the same all over the United States.
I'm sure that's true. Yeah. I'm looking at number 2, though. Let's talk about the context. What would reparations look like in the context of the racial dynamics of America?
And that's what I was saying. It looked different in different places.
Right. Okay. Which is why, if it could be something that could be done by the federal government, but get, parceled out to the states to do it the way worked best there. But given the times that we're in right now, it's hard to imagine that being done in any kind of equitable way. Julie?
I do think of something I'm seeing happen right here in our own community. And it's a great encouragement to me that, you know, the hood or whatever we've called it, the city is focusing on the Doyle community right now and bringing things to that area of town that the rest of us take care of it for granted. Good parks, good community facilities. I think it's wonderful.
I do too.
And it's got to start perhaps at the community level.
Yeah. Okay, so number 3, for racial reconciliation to happen within the American church, what are some of the costs the majority culture will need to pay? What price will communities of color have to pay? The second one is a little harder to imagine because it seems like they've already paid so much. But maybe it means putting up with white people more than they do now. I don't know. It was interesting, the story she tells about her friend Elizabeth and the costs that she has endured because people get tired of listening to her, you know, and it takes people like that sometimes, though, to be that thorn in the flesh or itch in the skin. She's a pretty amazing young woman, I imagine.
How do you envision racial reconciliation within the church? Does that mean that we have mixed congregations, or what exactly is she getting at, do you think, in the question?
I think she's getting, well, yes, I think that's probably part of it. But it seems to me that until there is more racial reconciliation within the society, that churches aren't, you know, where people live together, they're in the neighborhoods together, they go to neighborhood churches together. It's going to be hard to see much change there. You see it in the wider church. It's to me one of the biggest blessings of my life was being able to work for Mission Presbytery and be allowed to go to larger events with representatives from many different churches. And I think I may have told you the first time I ever heard the song, the African American spiritual song that we heard, that Lift Every Voice. It was eye-opening, you know, to be with a group of African Americans who knew that song and stood up when it was being sung. And often those events there would be an African American choir. In one case, I went to one where was a Korean choir, and it was fabulous too. You know, we miss so much when we segregate ourselves. We really, there's such a wealth of whatever could be a blessing of knowing more, experiencing more. Those of us have traveled in other countries you come away feeling like you've learned so much about others and how others live, and what a blessing that is. And it could be that way in the church too, if we.
But don't you think the church is just going to be a byproduct of a much greater integration in the whole community through the educational and the business world and the workplace?
Unfortunately, I do. Yeah, I think that for us to be extremely intentional is. Yeah, I was thinking about it the other day. What if I decided to move my membership to Mount Olive? You know, would that do any good? I don't know. You know, but that's the kind of intentionality that I think would have to happen. And I don't think many of us are going to do that. You know, I wouldn't expect them to do it. Why should, you know, but again, I give God praise for Fred and BK and their child, because how much enrichment they bring to us. You know. Reminders of what we don't have. Okay, I'm turning the page. So, a hard question. What is the risk of not making reparations?
Well, I think we're seeing it. And I mean, spiritually as well as physically. If we don't do something, things will just continue to get worse. Because if we just look at the length of time since that, I call it encyclical, I can't think of a better word, but since that action by the church, Judy, that commission report, yeah. I mean, just think of the amount of time that's gone by and how little has changed, but as far as action is concerned from that, but look how much the world has changed. Our country has changed. And, you know, doing nothing is a decision, isn't it? Mm-hmm. To do nothing is not inert, it's a decision. And so I just, I think we have to be, part of the confession is to be aware that if we don't try, even if it's something small in our own communities, like risking being uncomfortable and reaching out to people who don't look like us, who don't worship like we do, if we're not willing to take that risk, then we have to be prepared to take the consequences. And I think there are so many consequences to all of us. And it's easy to not see that in a community like this. But if we lived in a big city, if we lived in big cities, I just think that there's a powder keg. We're in a powder keg time, and that to me is the big risk of not doing anything, that things will just really get worse. Because we need to do something as a government as well as individuals. It takes all of us, not just a policy is great, policy is good, but it's not the only avenue, is it? You know, we have to do things individually in our own little corner of the world.
Bonnie?
When you have to make a big change in the way of thinking of the people, you know, the majority of people, in Africa, the women were the ones that did most of the work, and they started with the children. You have to kind of change people's attitudes at a younger age, but the adults have to do that too. They have to at least expose the children to be more inclusive in our society. I think if we do it with the church as it is now, with the adults, the cost would be the loss of many of our constituents.
I think you're right. And I mean, we've all experienced this, you know, the way our children today think about homosexuality. You know, they think we're nuts. You know, they have so moved on. And yet people of our generation and older have hung on to it as something that is sacrosanct, is that the right word? And it did cost. It cost us. You know, we know that. I think you're right. But I think it has happened. Look at Tanishi. Look at how his age. Look at Latasha. Her age. That generation of African Americans who have become very well educated, who write, who advocate, who speak, they're beginning to get through. I don't think we would have seen what we saw this last summer after George Floyd's death if it hadn't been for people like them. Mm-hmm. Look at Jennifer, who's been reading, and her children who are reading and trying to understand how to make a difference.
I think there is a receptivity here this year that I've never felt before. And maybe it's just the collision of COVID, the racial unrest, and all of the incidents that have triggered it in the economy. But people are listening and they're waking up. And that's the first step. Before, we've just swept everything under the rug and tried to ignore it and go on. And so I think this is an opportunity that hasn't come our way for some time.
Yeah, I think we're all feeling that. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say this, Tracy, don't forget that half of the country almost took the opposite to what you just said.
I know.
And now the real question is, how do we reconcile with them, or how do we individually reconcile with them? I think we do have an opportunity. I think, just as you said, we have a great opportunity.
Well, personally, I think this election, I was so distraught. And then I started thinking, maybe not holding the Senate may not be all bad. Maybe there will be some inaction so everybody can calm down, breathe slowly, and get a vision as to what we want to do that's positive instead of destructive. So I don't know. I'm trying to be Pollyanna. It's kind of hard at times, but
I think we could pull it a little closer to home and look at our own church. And this is a mighty small group, but we have
mighty. That's a good word, mighty.
I think we do have an obligation to try and reach out to other members and start, and to be honest, we're going to have to be very aware of their feelings, because we don't want to totally turn them away. We want to bring them more our way. And so this is where we can start. I mean, I don't see me starting in a national level. So, you know, but maybe I can be some influence within our own church. And it becomes a risk. We can lose members because we've lost members over other issues. We're going to have a lot of folks who, due to their age and their beliefs they've held all along, are not going to change. They're not open for change. So, you know, we just have to be compassionate and careful and see what we can do.
Well, I think that's where we are right now. I think we're reading, we're talking, we're struggling, we're trying to figure out what we could do that would be positive. And I'm not sure we're there yet or how we go about doing it, but I think you hit the nail on the head, Sue. We have to just keep trying and in hopes that we can make a difference.
I've had some good conversations with people who are on the other side of the political perspective. And basically, we just approach each other in respect and want to understand how they feel. And if it's a good relationship, they ask how I feel. And we've just had some good exchange of ideas. And to me, that's all we can do in a peaceful way.
John?
I'll just say one more thing and I'll shut up. I'm sorry. But, you know, just like Zacchaeus, we need to, we all need to sacrifice, and we have to be willing to do that. And in your conversations with people, that has to be known. And that's to give something up like he did, you know, half his wealth. Are we willing to do that? And I know the answer. And so we just have to decide what can we do? How much is of our time, talents, or money are we going to give up? So.
But I think, and John, I think that the first thing we have to give up is perhaps a way of thinking. You know, we have to, as you said, and as we've all said, you know, almost half the country felt differently. And so part of this reparation for me is like Julie said, entering into those uncomfortable conversations, but from a position of, I know there's a reason why you think the way you do. My best friend votes differently from me. I love her. She's been like a sister to me. So to find a way to enter a conversation and say, you know, tell me why, or how are you feeling about this? How do you think? You know, that's the first thing, isn't it? To go into it in a frame of mind that's open to a different way of thinking, even though it might be very uncomfortable.
Well, and the good thing is we usually find several things we're in agreement about.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know about you all, but every time we have one of these sessions, I'm always kind of exhausted afterwards. And it's awakened new thoughts that I had never approached. And it's so troubling and grappling. But I was thinking of John Lewis and Good Trouble. And I kept thinking all of these pairs of things that go together. And I had written down dynamic frustration is the way I feel about this. We're trying to do something, but it's really, really frustrating and exhilarating fatigue. It's those contrasts and it's a good thing that there's some positive too, but oftentimes the positive can overwhelm the negative when you keep chipping away at it. So.
I agree. I felt exhausted yesterday as I watched the acceptance speeches last night. I found myself just in tears. I couldn't stop. And I realized it was an emotional response because I was so mentally and emotionally fatigued.
Did you see on CNN the Black correspondent who talked about he cried the whole time. It was beautiful. I think Jenny shared it on Facebook, but he said the thing that came out of this for me is that my children now can see that the character counts. It's important. And he was a Black father, and it was powerful. I cried during that one too. I cried a lot yesterday.
I think
Jennifer's note. Oh, go ahead.
That fellow came across with so much of the emotion that from the things we've been reading and studying and whatnot, we've become aware of, but maybe a broader audience witness that to understand how the white privilege affects things and the frustration and the current concern of the Black community. I think it was wonderful that he did what he did.
I have to see that. Now, I was going to say, Jennifer shared with me this morning in her note that she probably wouldn't be able to join us, that Caroline, her daughter, who's I think 8th grade, just cried all day. And she has been so upset by what all has gone on during the election. And the fact that a woman was elected to be the vice president was overwhelming to her, that it finally happened. And so it's affecting all generations. Yeah.
One other thing, I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, you're not. No.
One other thing that touched me yesterday, maybe not in the same way, but Frank happened to be going down Main Street when the flag parade and everything was courthouse lawn. Well, a woman with her 2 daughters was on the catty corner holding up BLM signs and Biden signs. And one of the people with the flags took the time to walk over to this woman and her children and just start yelling at her. Finally, the woman had to put the Biden sign up in front of her face to protect her from what was coming at her with these 2 girls. It was so sad.
Yeah. So I think Jennifer's had that experience too by taking her children there. So not what we want. Well, we're about at our end of our time, so I'm going to read the prayer of reparation on page 169, and you can follow along. I'll give you a moment to find that. Lord, Those who have come before me were flawed. I am also flawed. Open my eyes, Lord. Am I guilty of muting the pain-filled volume of my sisters and brothers with my skewed sight? Have I prioritized my comfort over the equality and equity of my neighbors? Have I ignored the ways our systems have oppressed and suppressed others? Forgive me, Lord. I am in need of repair. Give me the heart and voice of reconciliation, and show me what it means to actively make reparations to those around me. Provide a heart of righteous determination as I work to be the person you want me to become. In your redemptive name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, everybody have a good week.
Thank you, Judy.
Read
Yeah.
chapter 9.
Thank you for all the extras, the readings and the
Good.
videos and today's document that we probably might not have found on our own.
Okay, and I'll send you that link to the YouTube with Tanisi Coates. Okay.
Yeah.
You guys
Because
have a lot
actually,
on it.
when you pull it up, you'll see others around you. You may want to look at some others too. So, all right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
Judy.